e5, a5. Black's philosophy is to wait and bank on the fact that white will run out of moves eventually. So black allows white to grab the center, and he shuffles. So sooner or later, white is forced to sacrifice material. The drawback of black's strategy is that white will gain a huge attack in return because white will use all the time in the world that he needs, unprovoked, to improve his position in the most advanced squares possible. So h5, and now it's high time for black to play h6, as he did in the game. h6 is absolutely correct, and black should always play it whenever white plays h5 in the rook shuffle. Because after g6, it becomes harder for white to advance the g-pawns. If white wants to advance the g4 pawn to g5, then he has to be prepared to sacrifice an h-pawn. So actually, h6 is a restrictive utility to cramp white's king side a little bit. So rook a7, h4, rook a8. Now I have to take because it's the only way to progress my advancements without sacrificing material. He has to take, and now e6. Black retreats, and that's correct. Black should not take on e6 because white is left with 4 pawns on the e-file versus 3 pawns on the e-file. Yes, white will have to take trade on d7 sooner or later if black retreats. So yes, black should retreat so that white has less pawns on the e-file. By having less pawns on one of your central files, it makes it harder for you to progress and prolong your attack. It makes your development a little bit more staggered, and it keeps your fire relatively short-lived. So if black does not retreat the king, then he is easily losing. So e5, rook a7, e4, rook a8. Technically, black should already have been shuffling the kingside rook, but he figures it out the next move. The point is that as soon as a g-pawn comes off the board and trades off the f-pawn, black should be happy to start shuffling the kingside rook, because when the queen-sided rook is shuffled, it can be discoordinated on a7. Oftentimes, a7 is an important square for the black queen to sit on, because based on the geometric configuration on the queen side, the queen will never be trapped on a7. It's a very safe square. So yeah, first black should make sure the rook's on a8, and then secondly start shuffling the h-rook instead. So he does that. I take because it's the only way to further my development without sacrificing. And now we reach one of our critical moments. This is like the mainline crossroad. White has 2 main options, actually only 2 options that are playable. The first playable option is g5, and the second playable option is e6. So g5, in my opinion, is objectively winning for white, but harder to play, whereas e6 is probably objectively winning for black, but easier for white to play. The nature of g5 is more positional. You are cutting the f6 square from the knight. It's a positional sacrifice, so you give up this h-pawn. You also put the rook in Zugzwang, but you cut the square, and you put the rook in Zugzwang in exchange for a pawn, basically. Whereas e6 is very sharp and tactical after the knight goes to f6 and trades off on d5. we get very tactically messy position and also easier for white to play. So I chose g5. So knight takes g5, g4, rook h4, g3, rook h3. Okay, the drawback for white, there are two drawbacks behind this approach. The first drawback is that you immediately sacrifice material, although white has to sacrifice material sooner or later anyway. The second drawback is that the g5 pawn is loose, so that makes it much harder for white to conduct an attack on the king side. So by playing g5, white is pretty much committed and understanding that his play will actually be based around the queen side, because the king side is compromised for white. So e6, knight b8, this was in the game, c6, and black starts shuffling this rook again. He pretty much has to. If he plays rook h8, that would be bad, because then all of a sudden white is able to play on the king side and conduct a strong attack. So after white improves his position, like this, you know, like this, white has an idea of playing h6. Maybe even now it can be played, or maybe you can play first to play b6 and then take and then play h6. But anyway, h6 is a strong and thematic idea, so that you can attack with f6, and then you'll play f5 on the next move. For example, take everything on f6, white will play f5, and white will just push on the king side and center and try to checkmate black. Just play a vicious attack, maybe throw in b6 so that you can play d6. So it's just a very aggressive idea, and in practice it's very good for white. So ultimately it is bad for black to pull back his kingside rook when it's on h3. That's why white puts the rook in Zugzwang. This rook is in Zugzwang. So yeah, black should shuffle the other rook. So c5, take. You have to take sooner or later. You might as well take now, because you can gain a tempo like this. And then c4, c5. And now I guess we reach the most important position in the video. This is a critical moment. Actually, after this, it's a critical moment. So, let's say white plays e5, e4, and we get this position. White has two moves. He can play c2 or c3. One is good, the other is bad. Basically, you want to time it so that the rook lands on a7 at the end of the line of the improvement phase. I don't know how to explain this in words, so I'm just going to play out the moves. First, we time the rook on a8, okay? If we time the rook on a8, we play c3, and now the rook is on a8, and the improvement phase is finished. The second scenario is to play c2 to reserve a tempo so that the rook lands on a7 instead of a8. And that's what you want. That's what you want, is the rook to land on a7. I did not play this way. I played the inferior way, where I timed the rook to play on a8. I had my reasoning for it, which was a cunning trap, but actually black knew the idea and sidestepped it and refuted my whole opening system. So this is good for white here, because white will play b6, and since the rook is on a7, it obstructs the queen from going to a7. This means that he has to now retreat the queen back to its home square, or towards the home square. But then the problem is that black is very close to lost after b5, because there's this idea of attacking the rook with b6, and then, so let's just say, just something like this. And then after the rook reacts, white can actually trap the queen. So black has to play very resourceful, and I think objectively white is winning, but it's a very complicated middle game. And you have to prove it for both sides, what you are doing, or what you know you're doing. So in the actual game, okay, so I timed it so that the rook lands on a8. My idea was a cunning trap. So first I play b5, and the point is that after rook a7, black immediately loses the game after taking and playing c5. So we get the same idea, and now the queen is trapped and it's game over. So this was what I was hoping for, but he knew this idea, and he played the correct move for black, which is queen c7. That's the best move. So, yeah, again, rook h8 would not work very well. Queen c7, that's the choice to play. So now I am hoping for the best, because my problem is that black has the a7 square for his queen. So I just take, he takes back, I play c5, queen a7, and b6. And queen a6, he attacks d3, so I block with c4. And now we reach an interesting position. At first, it looks like black is in Zugzwang. It looks like the rook can't move, the queen can't move, none of the pieces can move without sacrifice, and the rook should not move. So it looks like black is stuck. However, white is the one who's stuck. White is in Zugzwang, not black, because black has this one strong idea, which he knew, which is bishop b7. And the point is, if I take, then my queen side gets liquidated. I can never move the c pawns, otherwise this b6 pawn drops. And I don't have enough firepower to exert an attack. I mean, if I play d6, then that weakens the b6 pawn too much. Yeah, this is just bad for white. So in the game, I played c7, just a practical attempt to try to keep the fire alive. Ultimately, it's not enough. So knight d7, I pretty much have to take, because otherwise he will take on b6. And then I played b4. It might have been better to play e6. The idea is that he wants to put his king on c8 to monitor the queen side, but then this would allow me to start some sort of attack in the center. So after e5 here, it actually looks as if black is stuck again, because the king can't move, the rook can't move, the queen can't move, this rook should not move in principle. So what to do? Actually, black has bishop takes d5, but it's still very sharp and hard. So if queen takes d3, then actually I have some chances after d6. So this was definitely my best attempt. I'm not sure what are the best moves for both sides around this area. Maybe to play something like king b7, but yeah, I don't know. I have to play d6 here. He can just take, and it looks like black is just in time to hold everything together. So, but if he plays here, then it's much riskier, and maybe white can even win. So yeah, that's my best attempt, really. But I play b4, just trying to it's a decoy just to diverge the attention of the queen towards my back rank. So take, take, take. I just wanted to remove the pressure on the b6 pawn. So I play b5, just preparing c6. He wisely plays queen b4. That's a pretty strong idea. So c6, and the problem is that I can't really play c5 like I would want to, because then he would take on b5. So at this point I'm dead lost. So b3, rook a5, g6, he takes, and he just completely liquidates my queen side. So it's over, completely over. So as you can see, he split up my pawns, so I only have a 3 thick island, I have a 1 thick island, and a 2 thick island. So it's over, and I resign at some point. Right here, I resign, of course. And it's a very good illustration about why it's better to time the rook on a7 rather than to time the rook on a8, because when the rook's on a7, the queen can never sit on a7, right? So a very nice trick. I don't know what's the best word, but it just comes to show that c3 is probably losing and c2 is probably winning. How crazy is that, right? What got me into Horde in the first place is this very opening for black, the rook shuffle, because it's just so fascinating. It's so nuanced. It's just crazy how in this complicated looking position, it's like, okay, one thrust wins and the other thrust loses. How can that be? What's the difference? How does it change anything, right? It changes everything. Yeah, it's crazy. But, you know, playing such openings for black is very useful for improving your comprehension and even your strength, because you learn a lot of subtleties that that you need to use in order to convert to the full point win. So rook shuffle, yeah, you should try to play it as black if you want to be a serious player, a professional player, because these such ideas will translate to other openings, and then you can borrow some of those ideas and play in a much more educated fashion. Alright, I think that's all there is to cover for this game. I hope you learned something. Take care. Thanks.